Hi everyone, welcome to what I think is probably your sixth lecture of this unit. So we are moving away from African American civil rights and we're moving into other civil rights movements or other freedom rights movements. All right, so this is going to be essentially part 2, lecture 1. And I want to take a second to kind of lay this out for you because I just mentioned that this is probably lecture 6. So that means that we've done 5 lectures on African American civil rights. And this is going to be one of what I envision is 3 lectures on other freedom rights movements. And some of you are probably thinking, that doesn't seem very, very fair or very equitable. And you're right, it's not. So I don't have a perfect answer for you about why we would spend so much more time on African American civil rights than, say, women's rights or Latino rights or Native American rights, except to say that a lot of the work that we see happen in African American civil rights are going to kind of lay the groundwork for some of the later movements. African American civil rights are also much more studied, I would argue. It's where my personal research is. And it happens over a longer period of time. And so there are some reasons, but it's not a perfect balance. It's something that I, as a teacher, need to do a better job of covering or figuring out how I find a balance. But I'm going to do my best to give you some information about some of the other movements. All right. So one of the things to think about, how do we make a more equitable system, or how should our society function? And that might be through this term called social justice. This is a word that gets thrown around a lot, but I'm not sure that we have a good understanding of what it actually means. So, social justice, what it means is a fair distribution of advantages and disadvantages in society. So essentially, not that one group has all the good things happen to them in life and another group has all the bad things happen, but that they're evenly distributed. I have an equal chance of good and bad things happening to me in my life, and you have an equal chance of having good and bad things happen to your life. So sort of the bad stuff is spread amongst us all rather than just on a certain segment or more on a certain segment of our society. All right. One of the first things we're going to talk about, and also because I think so much of this history is very, very heavy. And so we're going to take a short little break into something that is not quite as heavy as some of the other movements. And that's to talk about counterculture, which is what you might commonly think of as the hippie movement. So what we see is what's known as a counterculture movement versus the establishment, which is essentially our generation gap. So you see all of these kids in the counterculture movement because they are baby boomers. So they are those kids that are born after World War II that are just becoming young adults or teenagers in the 60s. And they are really pushing back against the establishment or the mainstream society and older Americans. So essentially their families and their parents. And they're rejecting and abandoning a lot of what was seen as the way society functions. So we think of sort of the conformity in the 1950s and kind of looking to the government for answers. These counterculture, these baby boomers are absolutely leaving that stuff behind. And this is incredibly challenging or shocking to the older generation, particularly their parents, because they seem to be losing sort of the sense of right and wrong. And they are questioning authority. And if we think back to the last unit in the Cold War and the Red Scare, you don't question authority. You listen to the government, you follow what the government is saying. They're going to keep us safe. They know what's right. They know what's wrong. And these kids are saying, absolutely not. We think you're wrong. But you're setting up this challenge between the younger generation and the older generation. What makes the counterculture distinct is some of the things that they are either exploring or presenting, or how they're presenting themselves. So many of them are going to turn into like Asian religions or Native American religions and cultures. They're going to experiment with lots and lots of drugs. Their fashion's going to look different. It's not going to be as uptight or formal. It's going to be a lot of free-flowing clothes. It's where we get our tie-dye, our bell bottoms, our big hair, big like flower crowns, and all that sort of stuff. So much more relaxed. Some of it they're also taking from Native American culture as well. And then if you've ever heard the phrase sex, drugs, and rock and roll, That's absolutely a pretty good way of thinking about what's going on in a counterculture. So the norms about sexual relationships or relationships with other people are going to be a lot different, a lot looser than they've been in the past. A lot of experimentation and a lot of music. It's a big time for music, particularly rock and roll and things like that. I'll give you a list in a couple of slides. I do want to make sure that I point out one thing though. While many of the baby boomers might dress the same, they might be listening to the same music, they're not all necessarily the same in what they're doing. So some of them are going to participate in sort of these freedom movements, whether it's African American civil rights, anti-war movement, and those things. And some of them are just going to enjoy more of the pleasure part of the counterculture. So the more fun stuff and kind of leave the political stuff to others. So make sure you're recognizing just that there's a distinction between those who are participating in activism and those who are not. All right. So one of the movements or the activism that we might see under this category is the free speech movement. I think I've actually mentioned this before, but it's important to take some time to talk about it. It's really born out of a lot of the African American civil rights movements that we've talked about, particularly the Freedom Summer. Many of the white college students that participated in Freedom Summer are going to take those ideas that they're learning and they're going to bring them back to their colleges. Most famously, Berkeley, which is this picture right here. And they're going to challenge their campuses that they should be able to have an opinion and express their opinion, which is, again, something that we think of a lot on college campuses now, but it hadn't always been that way. So there's a push to increase that sort of openness to ideas. So you see it connected not only to the civil rights movement, but also anti-war, which is also happening a lot on college campuses. Now we're actually seeing an odd thing. We're seeing some of the tactics that the free speech movement used, or even African American civil rights or some of these other civil rights movements, by, how do I want to phrase this? Far right or right activists in the modern time. So more extreme activists like we might see, which I'm covering his face, with this guy right here, and some events that we've seen on college campuses in the last couple of years. You might be familiar with this woman, Kate Bennett, and essentially using a lot of the tactics that we've seen in other civil rights movements to kind of push a more aggressive right movement on campuses and different spaces, essentially that they should be able to come to these campuses and preach these things that many people think are not so civil. It's a complicated thing that's happening. But essentially, should we allow all sort of speech to happen on college campuses? Is that fair game? Is it okay to have far-right activists come? Is it okay to have somebody who is spewing hate speech? Are we going to protect those things? Do colleges have to allow those people to come and speak? To what extent do colleges have to protect those activists or those speakers? Literally, how much should they have to spend to be able to protect that? What is their burden, essentially, when it comes to that? And some really interesting conversations about what does it mean if the United States protects hate speech? Do you allow a Holocaust denier to come speak? Is that okay? And these are conversations that are difficult for people to have. And I'm not sure we found a great sort of compromise or way of kind of dealing with speech, even in 2020. This is just a little video if you're interested in kind of what that means on college campuses right now. All right. So besides just the free speech movement, you see some other campus protests, most famously at Columbia, which is where these pictures are. And that is kind of combined or coming out of the free speech and the civil rights movement. And one of the things that they're really pushing for is increasing the kinds of classes. So things like Black history courses, women's studies courses, ethnic studies courses. Again, these kids are not only the baby boomers, but many of them are also the product of Brown v. Board of Education. So starting to go to integrated schools, starting to have those conversations in the K-12 setting. And then when we get to the college setting, those things are missing. And so you see a lot of activism to demand that the colleges do a better job, that they are representative of who the country is and where the country is going. But one person who really does not like this activism is the FBI. And so J. Edgar Hoover, I believe, is where this quote comes from. He says of these college students that are asking for change or are activists, he says that this is revolutionary terrorism invading college campuses. So strong words about these nonviolent protesters who are trying to create more social justice. All right, so a little bit more lighthearted part of this sort of movement or this time frame, we see what is known as pop art. And pop art is popular art. Oftentimes it's very commercialized or it can be mass produced, much like we see with Warhol. Warhol is probably somebody you've at least heard of before, and these are some pictures of Warhol and some of his pretty famous works. Jeff Koons is not part of counterculture, but he is a modern day pop artist, and he is actually the guy who did the statue that's outside of the King's Arena. And these are some of the other things that he's pretty famous for. So his balloon dogs are one of the things he's most famous for. All right. But the counterculture, the stuff you're probably far more interested in or maybe familiar with, is really the extreme amount of let's call it experimentation that's happening. And so this right here is from what is known as Ken Keasley's Merry Pranksters bus, essentially. And what is going on? He had been a professor, if I believe correctly, and then he'd been doing some research on LSD or acid, and he is going to start doing these tests. So you can go on this lovely looking bus, take a test, and he will give you a certificate. Often the band The Grateful Dead is around or participating in this test with them. All right, and then sometimes fact is way stranger than fiction, or some of those things that sound like conspiracy theories is true. And what we know is that part of the reason that LSD ends up in the United States or among people is because it was part of a CIA experiment. They had been doing secret operations in the 1950s and 60s, but ultimately it's going to escape the lab. It's going to get out into American citizens. And part of the reason that that is going to happen is what is this program called MK Ultra. And essentially the CIA was doing these tests on unsuspecting Americans, sometimes even their own personnel. And that is going to lead to some problems. So this is from a Times article, which is probably linked on the bottom of here, or I can send it to you if you're interested. But it's a pretty incredible story about some of the things that the CIA is doing. So I'll just read you this little part. It says, it often involved hookers to lure in unwitting Johns for undisclosed testing, narcotics agents who slipped drugs into drinks, and a U.S. Marshal who held up a San Francisco bar not knowing he was high on acid. You know, what could go wrong with these experiments? But supposedly the reason that the government is doing that is because they essentially think that the Russian countries of Russia, North Korea, and China, they're going to use drugs to brainwash captured Americans, so we better be prepared for what they're going to do. I don't know how well that experiment worked out. But again, they often gave it to unsuspecting people, followed them, and watched them to see what would happen without interfering or stepping in if something bad happens. And there's a pretty infamous case of this where a CIA employee, Frank Olson, was drugged and has essentially a bad trip, and he jumps out a window and commits suicide. And the CIA does not tell his family, and they don't find out until like 1975, so 20 years later, that this is what happened. It was not that their father or their husband committed suicide. So some pretty crazy, horrific things. A couple years ago, Netflix did a documentary about this called Wormwood. It's not a great documentary, but if this stuff sounds interesting, it might be something that you check out. All right. One of the major scenes of the counterculture movement is San Francisco. So the Haight-Ashbury is a pretty infamous place for this. You can still kind of see the history of that if you go today. It's much more commercialized. It's much more like a place for like young professionals to have brunch now. I guess not right now in the middle of a pandemic, but when we're not in a pandemic. But it was kind of the center of the counterculture movement of all these different things. And the Summer of Love, which is going to be the summer of 1967, is often thought of kind of the high point of, no pun intended, of this movement. So sort of all of this music and this performance, all of this art connected to these performances in these posters. And so it's a massive combination of music, drugs, and it says missing children. And what that means really is that there's a lot of young people that are fleeing their, suburban homes or wherever it is that they're living, and running away essentially to these kind of hot spots for the counterculture movement, without fully informing their families what it is they are doing. Right. Sorry about that. All right. So one of the major influences that we're going to see is music. And you go from sort of, I don't know, more like carefree music in the Beatles, like I Want to Hold Your Hand, to more radical or more thought provoking music in things like Revolution and Satisfaction. Um, One of the other interesting things that we're going to see is the Beatles will refuse to perform with segregated audiences. So they're kind of putting their foot down when it comes to civil rights, at least when it comes to their audiences. But the other thing we're going to see is the commercialization of revolution. So essentially, as we see the counterculture movement take off, as we see kind of rock and roll take off, we're going to see that major companies are going to try and find a way to essentially capitalize on what the young people are doing. We talk about how they do that in 2020 as well. So things like the Rolling Stones are going to do a song for a cereal commercial. Or, how do you mass produce the bell bottoms that the counterculture kids are wearing, et cetera, et cetera. Let's see. And then, and just in case you don't know, this is Bob Dylan, who is probably less famous to you guys today than, say, the Beatles, but one of the major peoples from this time in music. All right. But if we're talking music, you got to know about Woodstock. So Woodstock is this incredible event in 1969 in New York. It's 3 days. There are something like 500,000 people there. So any of you who are like, Coachella is where it's at, I want to do that at some point in my life, Coachella has nothing on Woodstock. Woodstock is massive. It's the largest music festival ever. It's so big that you see all these people, they're trying to get to the festival. All these people start showing up early. The producers of this event are not ready for them. They don't have fences up. They're not ready to take tickets. So all these people start camping out, and they have to make a decision. Do we kick everybody out and make them come back with their tickets? We just let them stay? What are we going to do? And they make the decision that they're just going to let these people go. They don't want to riot on their hands, essentially. So you're going to have this massive amount of people, but not everybody can get there. Literally, people are going to just leave their cars on the side of the road and try and walk the rest of the way. But lots of people have to turn around. So the organizers of Woodstock are actually going to lose $1 million, or over $1 million in this. They are not as maybe savvy as the people that are running Coachella now. So they don't think to like make a bunch of T-shirts and things like that. So there's not a lot of things for them to profit off at the event, like we would think of today. They're mostly worried about like, do you have enough fresh water for 500,000 people? Are there enough bathrooms? Like all of the logistic things. And also, if you have this much traffic, how do you get your performers there? So lots of performers are going to show up late. They might have to be helicoptered in, all this sort of crazy stuff. So Richie Havens is going to be the first performer. He wasn't supposed to be, but he's there early and nobody else is there. So they're going to send him out to perform for hours. And there's a moment, and that's what this clip is right here, of him singing. And he's like delusional. He's so tired. And he starts singing this song called Freedom. And you can just see that he's kind of starting to lose it. And he essentially just like walks off. He's just so tired. He can't do it. He says he has no recollection of this song that he performs that ultimately becomes a hit of his. But then by the time he's like, I've had enough, I gotta go, some more people start to show up. And this is just a list of a lot of the major people that came. They didn't do a very good job of like filming the event. So there's not a great video from Woodstock. So a couple of these I think are videos from the actual event, and some of them are just some of the other songs. So you might check it out, especially if any of this music is your thing. There's some Jimi Hendrix on there, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, a lot of these performers are not going to make it that much longer. Janis Joplin is going to die pretty soon after this. as is Jimi Hendrix. So it's kind of like a once in a lifetime opportunity to see these artists. One of the really interesting things is even though you have 500,000 people there that are doing a lot of drugs, a lot of things while they're there, nobody actually dies in the event itself. There is one person who dies kind of as they're cleaning it up. He is overslept. He is still there, and a forklift will kill him or squish him. But nobody during the actual event itself. The fact that it stays nonviolent and there's no major issues is pretty dang impressive. All right. But not everything about counterculture is the fun stuff. There's an ugly side to counterculture as well. And I'm actually going to go ahead and just play you this really quick thing about communes, and then I'll touch back with you in what in the world is going on.
You're up early.
Where's my daughter?
She's probably at the creek getting water.
I don't think so.
It's a beautiful night and a beautiful morning. Did you see the sunrise?
It's a beautiful morning, isn't it?
It's time to leave Shangri-La, baby. Take a good look, say goodbye to your friends.
You're doing so well, Daddy.
Fine, you don't want to say goodbye? Let's go.
Hey, man, leave her be.
Well, Sprout, you feel like driving the truck today?
No one's going to help you take me away from here. They know this is where I want to be.
I don't care what you want. I don't care what they want. It's over. Let's go.
I don't know why I assumed you were more open-minded.
Well, I'm not. I understand the temptation. And I know everyone your age is running away and screwing around. But you can't. You're a mother.
Ellery has everything he needs.
He needs his mother. I'm sorry, but you don't get to do this.
Goodbye, Daddy. Let me go! Let me go! Right now!
How could you just leave him? He's your baby.
How did you feel when you went away to work, Daddy? Your conscience must have been eating you alive. Calling your secretary from a hotel to pick out a birthday present for me? I'm sure you were sick. It's not that hard, Daddy. You'll be fine.
All right. Be not started. Sorry. Okay, so some of you are like, what in the world did you just show us, Miss Dietrich? Okay, so what you're seeing in that clip is from Mad Men, which we've seen a couple times in our time together. But essentially, this woman has left for a commune. She's exploring other ways of living, other living arrangements. But what you might have picked up from there is that she's a mom and she's left her child with his father. But her own father, who's the older generation, the establishment, is coming to try and get her and remove her from this. And she's not having it. She doesn't want to go. She doesn't want to have to live this mainstream life. She wants to be able to make her own choices. And she's essentially calling him out. Like, you think you had it so good. You think you did everything right, but you didn't. You relied on other people to take care of me. You weren't such a good father. Why are you making me kind of live up to your standards? And while it's not the majority of people that are running off and going to live in communes, you see this distinction between how people think that you should live, or what are our options? Like, what can you do? What is allowed? Or what can you imagine about kind of living arrangements? But what we see is overall that the counterculture movement is going to be pretty short-lived. It's not sustainable. Many of these young people are leaving behind their families. They don't have jobs. They don't have an education. They don't really have a way to kind of take care of themselves in the long term. And the other thing is, if you are doing that much drugs, to be completely honest with you, you are ripe to be exploited, to be taken advantage of. And what we see is this guy right here, which is kind of the best example of that. This is Charles Manson. He looks pretty crazy in here. This is a picture of him much older in his life. I'm sorry, this thing is in the way. And you can see that he has carved a swastika in his head. So he's a fascinating character. Sinister is a pretty appropriate word for him. So Charles Manson is essentially running a little cult. I shouldn't say little, it has consequences. And he convinces part of his Manson family to go commit murder. And they're going to murder an actress that is Sharon Tate, who's 8 months pregnant, and some other people. And he's not there, but essentially he had them do it. So they are going to be incarcerated, and he too will be incarcerated until the day that he dies. But this is really going to show people that sort of ugly side of the counterculture movement and sort of these cults that we start to see in the late 60s, early 70s kind of pop up. And so it's a reminder that there is this ugly side to the counterculture movement, and it's not all sex, drugs, and rock and roll are the fun things. And what we're going to see is a major backlash to the counterculture movement as we move into the 70s, away from this sort of free way of living and more to law and order, that this is what we expect. However, sort of the looseness of the counterculture, particularly when it comes to our relationships or how we view sexual relationships or how we dress and those sort of things, are going to be much looser than they have been in the past. So clothes is going to get more casual, kind of our relationship with others might get more casual in a way that you might think is a good thing or maybe a bad thing. Okay. The last thing I'll point out on here is I don't have a picture on here, but a couple years ago there was a TV show called Aquarius that is kind of about LA at this time and Charles Manson at the time, which I think is pretty good. The first season's pretty good, second season not so good. So if you can find that, you might check it out. It does a really good job of kind of bringing a lot of these movements into perspective or kind of how they're connected to each other. And then you might have heard of this Quentin Tarantino movie called Once Upon a Time that came out last year. And it is essentially reimagining the Manson story. So if the Manson story had a much different ending. It's a long movie. It's pretty slow, so it might not be all of your jam. And then it's very violent, so it might not also be your jam. But it's pretty fascinating if you like that sort of thing. All right. I posted this already, but some of you might be wanting to check it out. It is about the counterculture, or a lot to do with the counterculture, and it's really looking at the Manson family and the murders and saying perhaps there's some other things going on. Perhaps this is more connected to some of law enforcement's experiments with drugs than maybe we thought. A little bit, actually, some stuff to do with the JFK assassinations and some other things. So if you're into weird, trippy history, you're into perhaps conspiracies, you're into the role that the FBI or the CIA is playing at this moment, I urge you to check it out. It's quite fascinating. All right, so from counterculture, we're going to talk about what often is referred to as the beginning of the LGBT movement. That's not an accurate way to kind of describe what's happening, but it's a major moment in the LGBT movement, and that's what's known as the Stonewall Riots. So this is in New York in 1969. And what we see is it is not essentially acceptable or even legal really to be gay at this time or part of the LGBT community. And so in this part of New York, there is a mafia bar that is a gay bar. Essentially, mafia is profiting off of it. It doesn't have a liquor license. It doesn't even have running water. But it's a place where lots of young people from the LGBT community, particularly homeless LGBT members, can hang out and be safe and kind of be with like-minded people or people that respect them. And so it's this special place in New York City, but it is often shaken down by law enforcement, who essentially expect to get paid off and then they go about their way. But one day, those who were there at the bar that night have had enough of the law enforcement harassment, essentially, of the bars as well as the LGBT community. And so they essentially fight back. They start throwing things at police officers, essentially kicking the police officers out, and it's going to expand. The community around them, even the straight community around them, is pretty sympathetic to the plight of these young people. And so they're going to start participating as well. So kind of this fighting back against the oppression and harassment. So this is going to be kind of the starting point that will lead us to kind of much I would say, larger or more wider LGBT movement, particularly kind of seeing the pride parades that are going to kind of come out of this about a year later. We'll see that, but it's not the beginning of any sort of movement. And we know this maybe a little bit from our last unit with the lavender scare, but I can kind of show you some more specifics. You've seen some publications and some groups in the 1950s start to form, and kind of have some publication. One of the most famous one was the Mattachine Society, and they actually go all the way to the Supreme Court to essentially say that their publication is not obscene, that it is fit to be published, that it can be published. The government can't prevent people from reading it or accessing it. You'll see an early lesbian organization as well. But these two that are born out in the 1950s and deserve a lot of credit for being some of the first organizations, they don't necessarily adapt after Stonewall. So they don't sort of become as radical as maybe some of the activists after Stonewall, or they don't kind of stay up with the times, for lack of a better word. So they'll die out. They won't necessarily adapt. This is something that we often see with movements, not just the LGBT movement, the women's movement, African American movement as well, that early groups maybe don't fit the needs of the group or of the movement as it goes through the times. So their work is really important, even if it doesn't quite fit into wherever that organization or that movement is in the later time. I've probably mentioned this before, but if not, I urge you to check this out. This is called Making Gay History. And it is a gay man who has interviewed a lot of people involved in different historical events. And he recorded it in like the 1980s, and then he's gone back and made a podcast out of it. I'm not sure if the one that I have here is tied specifically to these organizations, but if not, you can find ones that are specific to these organizations or Stonewall or lots of other ones. He's really good at what he does, so I urge you to check out that podcast. All right, and Harvey Milk, you may or may not have heard about. He was one of the first openly gay public officials in the United States. He's in San Francisco. He had been he was the city council supervisor. He's elected in 1977, so we're jumping forward a little bit in time. But he is ultimately assassinated. He gets assassinated by this guy right here, Dan White, who essentially lost to Harvey Milk in this election. So Dan White will assassinate him, as well as the mayor, so Mayor Moscone, who's right here. So if you've ever been to San Francisco, the Moscone Center is named after him. However, Dan White is going to use what's known as the Twinkie defense. So any of you who are taking AP psychology might have heard of the Twinkie defense. But it is this really stupid defense, for lack of better words, essentially that he ate too much junk food and he went crazy. He's not responsible for his actions. And it kind of works. He does not get what I would call the full weight of responsibilities for his actions, for assassinating Harvey Milk and the mayor of San Francisco. So we'll have what's known as the White Night Riots. Essentially, the city of San Francisco will respond to the fact that Dan White is not held accountable. Dan White will ultimately commit suicide, but he's not, at least in the American justice system, held accountable. However, Harvey Milk kind of knows that there is kind of a target on him. He knows that he is pushing the envelope, that he is trying to expand what America accepts. And so he is open with that. And I think these two quotes kind of help us think about that. So one of them, he says, if a bullet should enter my brain, let that bullet destroy every closet door. So you might actually think about, I showed you a quote from Fannie Lou Hamer. And she talks about, I might not survive my activism, but I'm going to make change in that process. I'm going to fall forward. And Harvey Milk is saying, I might not survive this, but I'm hoping that I make enough progress with what I can do before my time comes. And then there's this other quote from him, and he says, gay people, we will not win our rights by staying quietly in our closets. We're coming out to fight the lies, the myths, the distortions. We're coming out to tell the truth about gays, for I am tired of the conspiracy of silence, so I'm going to talk about it. And I want you to talk about it. You must come out. So then this is in the 1970s, so we might think about how much progress we've made since Harvey Milk. All right. And sometimes what is old is new again. So one of the things that we see right now is sort of an attack on the rights of transgender people. And what we've seen is sort of an opening or an acceptance under the Obama administration, and then a rollback of that in the current administration, particularly when it comes to access to medical help, um, rights in the workforce or just in society, and serving in the military. There was some new regulation that was put in place to protect um, transgender people from in their service to America. So putting their life on the line to help America or to serve America that we've definitely seen roll back. And so if you're interested, there's an entire article about what are the consequences of the government doing that. So from there, I'm going to kind of talk about Native Americans in this moment. And so one of the things that I think is hard for us to think about is in relative living conditions, Native Americans actually have it worse. If we look at education levels, if we look at poverty levels, if we look at health levels, but they're actually such a small percentage of our population. It's under 1%. We tend to kind of forget sort of what their fight looks like, whether we're talking about in the 1960s or we're talking about 2020. Even if we talk about COVID-19, the Native American tribes are being hit very, very hard by the virus and have less ability to sort of fight back against the virus than the general population. So what are the consequences for that? Or why are we in a system like that or society like that? But for this moment, we see some failures under Eisenhower. He does what's known as termination policy, which is essentially all you need to know is it's a failure. Native Americans are going to get more support under LBJ in both the legislative branch, just from him in general. But really what we see change come from is from the activists themselves or from the Native Americans themselves. And this is what's known as the Red Power movement. This is kind of an important thing because we naively might think of Native Americans as a single group, but they are part of different tribes. So hundreds, if not thousands of tribes in the United States, and they view themselves differently. But the Red Power movement is one of the first times that we see them come together and recognize that even though they belong to different tribes, that there is strength in sort of their unity and working together to try and fight back against some of the oppression or discrimination in the United States. So under that umbrella of the Red Power movement, we're going to see what's known as AIM, so the American Indian Movement. And they're going to be more militant than sort of some of the other Red Power movement or groups. So you might think of them as similar to the Black Panthers versus some of the other activists or other groups that we talked about. And sort of two of the main events that we see under this is the occupation of Alcatraz. Essentially, there's a very old treaty that says the Native American tribes can access unused federal land. So the prison had no longer been in use, and so they decided they're going to take it over. They hold it for, I believe, almost a year or about that time frame before the federal government essentially removes them from Alcatraz. These are some pictures. You can still see this at Alcatraz today of the spray painting from when they occupied Alcatraz. So sort of that legacy. It's not ultimately successful, but it does an important job of directing attention to Native American issues and trying to kind of force America to see the issues and to kind of create some change. We'll see something similar at Wounded Knee. At Wounded Knee, you see there's going to be an occupation of Wounded Knee by some activists from AIM for over 71 days, even though you can't see this. And essentially, they're trying to force the government to make some change. There's a Native American part of the government that is supposed to essentially be helping Native American tribes, and they believe that there's a fair amount of corruption in that. So they want an investigation, they want legislative change, they want these things. And eventually the government will say, okay, we'll do those things if you essentially stop this occupation. What we see is the government essentially doesn't keep up their end of the bargain, which I don't think is going to come as a surprise to too many of us. So overall, the Red Power movement and AIM are more successful at kind of creating a unified group or a unified vision of maybe what Native American tribes need, and a little bit of legislative change, but it's more about the kind of pride and recognition than it is about legislative change. If you're interested, this is an article, I believe, or maybe a podcast about the anniversary of Alcatraz, so the 50th anniversary of the occupation. sort of just a couple years later after sort of that moment of activism, you're going to see that Marla Brandon is going to allow Little Feather, so this Native American activist, to give a speech, to use his 60 seconds when he wins his Oscars for The Godfather, to talk about the plight of Native Americans and that they are underrepresented in Hollywood as well as many other places in society. And this is an important moment because this is probably the height of his career, and he is allowing somebody else to use that opportunity, to use that moment for something else. It's a moment where he's definitely using his privilege to not try and make a change or recognize things that are happening in the United States. All right, but if we think about issues today, you might be familiar, or you might be a little bit too young to remember this, but a couple of years ago, there was a fight over a pipeline, so the Dakota Access Pipeline. And the reason that we see this fight is that this pipeline was going to be built right by the Standing Rock Reservation. And they were really upset about this because it gets moved from a majority, going right by a majority white city, to right by the reservation. So number one, why are you putting us in jeopardy over this city? Why do we have to take the brunt of what could possibly happen? And then just in general, why do we need this pipeline? Why are you willing to essentially put us in jeopardy with this pipeline? So there were protests. There was a long-standing sort of protest. Then where thousands of people went to try and prevent this pipeline from being built, including actually a lot of American veterans who felt strongly about this issue. One of the reasons I would argue it's pretty upsetting is it happened in the middle of the winter, and so it's freezing. And one of the things that law enforcement used was water hoses, essentially. So it was freezing, and so causing damage to some of these, again, nonviolent protesters. But essentially, so you see this protest between the two groups, and essentially the company that's making the pipeline essentially says that this is going to bring an economic boom. By allowing the oil to go through here. It also means that it's going to be less foreign oil, and so this is better for the United States. But those at Standing Rock and those who support those at Standing Rock essentially say that it's going to destroy their burial sites and sort of their sacred land and part of their reservation. And they also were talking about environmental concerns like contamination. This is our water supply. This is where we live. All of the things that come along with oil. And one of them they really talk about is water. What are you doing to the water supply? These pipelines are known for leaking. They're known for having major problems. Why is it that you're asking us why are you putting us in jeopardy? Why are you asking us to take that burden? And what we see is activism is pretty successful under the Obama administration. They're going to stop the pipeline. Trump will okay it and it will get built, but it's been leaking since 2017. But most recently, we've seen there's a new environmental investigation or looking at what are the environmental costs. So that's seen as kind of a win for the tribe and the activists. That's from March 2020. We'll see what happens. All right. This is actually probably the only extra credit opportunity I will give you this unit. I'm sorry. But this is on your journal from this week if you want to. I have a chapter from this book. And this book is by Sherman Alexie, who is writing, it's a fictionalized version of essentially his life as well as many of the people that he grew up with, about what it means to be Native American in modern times, what it means to live on a reservation, and sort of the issues of poverty and discrimination and major health problems that lots of Native Americans experience. So I urge you to check that out. Just keeping with a couple extra current things. We in California only have what is known as Indian casinos. It's the only way you can have a casino. So there's a lot of money involved in who is Native, where are the tribe lines, where can you build a casino, and so that gets pretty complicated. In Elk Grove, we know about that. We know that they're building an Indian casino. So how do you determine who can profit off of those, who identifies as Native, what tribe they belong to? Is it legit? Is it for some other reason? So it gets complicated. Still, relative marginalization or relative deprivation Native Americans are way up there when we talk about education issues, health issues, poverty. But again, they're such a small part of our population that we don't do a very good job of kind of recognizing the plight of natives. So then we have some questions to ask ourselves. How do we remember the past? How do we use it? How do we portray it? Is it okay if we have things like the Redskins? What does it mean if we are calling a football team the Redskins? Is that appropriate? And I would argue absolutely not. But they're still called that, right? Actually, just recently there was a thing about a butter company in Land O'Lakes who had a native person as their like part of their logo, and they just took that off. So some conversations about should you use native people as part of your logo? Is that like an appropriate thing to do? And then also some questions about like how do we identify ourselves? So, for example, Elizabeth Warren has for decades essentially said that she is part Cherokee, and so she was pretty vocal about that. And then she actually took a DNA test, and she angered the Cherokee tribe, who did not appreciate her essentially making that claim. When if you look at Elizabeth Warren, you would not consider her to be native, and when it comes to like DNA, it's a very small percentage that she would be native. So is it okay for her to refer to herself like that? She doesn't anymore, and I think she did a pretty good job of apologizing or trying to explain what she was trying to do. But we have questions like how do we identify ourselves? Can she call herself native? Is that an appropriate thing? Or I've talked about that. I know a lot about my history from my mom's work on genealogy, but would it be appropriate for me to claim anything other than white in 2020? And I would argue absolutely not. I look white. I benefit from being white. And so it would be inappropriate for me to try and maybe do something else. There are some quotes from the president up there. I'm just going to go ahead and leave those. If you want to look into his response to Elizabeth Warren, I will let you do that on your own time. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and we will come back for part 2, lecture 2 later. All right. Bye, guys.